Weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Today's topic is ego, friend or foe. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ begins his Beatitudes with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit in such a way as to merit the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean to be poor-spirited. Rather, it means to see oneself as owning nothing, since all belongs to God, for all is a manifestation of his consciousness. St. John of the Cross wrote, "If you would own everything, seek to own nothing. That which the ego relinquishes, offering it up to soul consciousness, is reclaimed forever in cosmic consciousness. Nothing is ever lost." Paramahansa Yogananda tells the story in Autobiography of a Yogi of the levitating saint, Badri Mahashaya. "Master," said a disciple of this saint once ardently, "you are wonderful. You have renounced riches and comforts to seek God and teach us wisdom." It was well known that Badri Mahashaya had forsaken great family wealth in his early childhood when single-mindedly he entered the yogic path. "You are reversing the case." The saint's face held mild rebuke. "I have left a few paltry rupees, a few petty pleasures, for a cosmic empire of endless bliss. How then have I denied myself anything? I know the joy of sharing the treasure. Is that a sacrifice?" The short-sighted worldly folk are verily the real renunciates. They relinquish an unparalleled divine possession for a poor handful of earthly toys. And the Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter states, "All things are everywhere by nature wrought in interaction of the qualities. The fool, cheated by self, thinks, 'This I did, that I wrought.' But thou strong-armed prince, a better lesson mind, knowing the play of visible things within the world of sense, and how the qualities must qualify, standeth aloof even from his acts." Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Okay.
A beaver and a rabbit were in the Grand Canyon together one day, and they were gazing upon an enormous dam that was built there in the canyon. It's huge width and breadth, and obviously very impressed. The rabbit turned to the beaver and said, "Wow, that's incredible. Is that your work?" And the little beaver puffed up his chest a little and he said, "No, but it's based on an idea of mine." So the Bhagavad Gita reading, "This I did, that I wrought," rings true to the beaver, and we all have a little beaver in us. But let me back up and introduce myself. For those of you that are new, welcome to our Sunday service in Ananda, Portland. My name is Badri. With me is Gita. I'm the beaver. She's the rabbit. Also with us, Swami Lorna and Surendra. And it's always wonderful to be together for our Sunday service. So thank you for coming both in person and online to share in this together. Today's topic of ego, being friend or foe, Swami Kriyananda's writing poses the question and gives us these beautiful examples from Autobiography of a Yogi, and again, that reading from the Bhagavad Gita. That first, of course, begs the question, what is ego? And as Paramahansa Yogananda himself defined it, it's simply and beautifully the soul identified, or we might say misidentified, attached or identified with the body, okay, with our personality, with our self-definitions. And the ego is really just basically who we are. It's who we think we are, anyway, and the way that we move through life. And it's constantly conditioned by outer and inner circumstances, such as I like this, or I don't like that, so let me have more of this, or avoid that. I'm hot and I need to cool off, and I'm hungry and I need to eat. I'm cool and I need a blanket, and on and on and on. The ego is just a way of defining ourselves. And it's limited by nature, but it's not always a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a foe, but there is an element of the ego that is necessary to move through this world. And we have to develop our sense of self, our will, and our energy in such a way that we can move effectively through the world. And as a young boy, Paramahansa Yogananda himself describes an experience where he was only 2 years old. He said one of his earliest memories was that he went to the drugstore with his nursemaid, and they were on some errand or another, and he only had eyes for one thing at the drugstore. That was these little orange candies that were there. And denied this simple pleasure, little 2-year-old Yogananda, or Mukunda, as he was called, went home and made it known to his mother that he wanted those orange candies. He said up until this time, people always said what a good little baby boy he was. And that night at bedtime, and every parent or caregiver can relate to some version of this story, little Mukunda made it clear he wanted those orange candies. He hadn't forgot. So much so was his fixation on the orange candies that his mother took him, and she was a formidable, powerful woman in her own right, took him to the drugstore that night, awakened the owner, the shopkeeper who lived there, and had to buy him some orange candy. And after that, Yogananda said, everyone said what a naughty little boy he was. But he also said it was magnificent to experience his will, to exercise his will, even at such a young age. And he also encouraged, Yogananda did, and Swami Kriyananda, his disciple, that in parenting, again, or as teachers, we can relate to this too, when we're working with children or with youth, not to stifle their will. And we know this is a razor's edge, that if we spoil or indulge a child's desires constantly, that has its own problems, doesn't it? But that we want to encourage them to develop a sense of self, a sense of will to be used rightly in the world. And it's the same with adults, and it's the same on the spiritual path, that we're developing a strong ego eventually, so that we can be successful in the world, and so that we can be good husbands or daughters or fathers or mothers or whatever it is, workers and on, but eventually so that we can find God. We want to develop a strong sense of self so that we can offer ourselves fully to the divine. And as it said in that reading from Affirmations for Self-Healing, that saints are beings of tremendous willpower and energy, but it's always used rightly. It's used in tune with God. And the ultimate tool for us as disciples of Paramahansa Yogananda, or followers of this spiritual path, is the practice of Kriya Yoga, a meditation and pranayama technique which Yogananda gave, the Kriya Yoga of Lahiri Mahashai, of our masters pictured on the altar, of Babaji, and in fact practiced for millennia by other enlightened saints throughout history, that this simple but profound technique, and we'll have a Kriya Yoga initiation later this month here in Nanda, Portland, is the backbone, literally our spine, of working with self-realization, of transcending the ego and our little self of consciousness into the divine self. I want to share with you a brief reading from Paramahansa Yogananda from his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, which I highly recommend if you have not read, or always to reread if you have. And this is from chapter 26, The Science of Kriya Yoga. Yogananda says, identifying himself with a shallow ego, man takes for granted that it is he who thinks, wills, feels, digests meals, and keeps himself alive, never admitting, through reflection, only a little would suffice, that in his ordinary life he is not but a puppet of past actions or karma and of nature or environment. Each man's intellectual reactions, feelings, moods, and habits are circumscribed by effects of past causes, whether of this or a prior life. Lofty above such influences, however, is his regal soul. Spurning the transitory truths and freedoms, the Kriya Yogi passes beyond all delusionment into his unfettered being. All scriptures declare man to be not a corruptible body, but a living soul. By Kriya, he is given a method to prove the scriptural truth. So you can see in this passage the divine gift of Kriya Yoga, which we practice in all of our meditation techniques here in all of our yoga practices, again, as a way to transfer identification from the body, from our little self, to the soul. Yogananda tells another story of a snake, a little serpent who was a poisonous snake outside a village in India. And this snake was known to attack the villagers and had even bitten some of them, and so was considered dangerous, rightly so. And the villagers pleaded with a holy man nearby to go and visit the snake and ask to make peace. And so this holy saint agreed and went to the snake and pleaded with it, brother snake, please leave the villagers in peace, leave them alone, and desist from attacking or biting the villagers nearby. And sensing the holy presence of this saint, the snake agreed and made his peace. And after some time passed, the holy man returned to the abode there of the snake near the village to see how his little friend was doing. And he was alarmed to see the snake was injured, lying there, had been struck with stones, and was hurt and crying out for help. And he said to the snake, "What happened to you, brother serpent?" And the snake replied, "You told me not to bite, to attack the villagers, and now they have come to attack me. And the children and the villagers have been throwing stones and have hurt me." And feeling compassion for the snake, nonetheless, the saint rebuked him and said, "You little fool, I told you not to bite, but I didn't tell you not to hiss." And so the moral of this story that Yogananda tells is, again, to develop our self, in the case of this little snake, in such a way to use our power rightly, never to do harm to another, as we know from the practice of ahimsa, nonviolence exemplified by Mahatma Gandhi in India, that as a social movement, as well as in our spiritual personal lives, that even to think harmful thoughts or judgmental feelings has a certain harmful effect on our own consciousness, that all of life is sacred, and that so to feel our oneness with spirit, we have to expand our own consciousness and use our sense of self, our ego, rightly in the world. Mainly what I want to share with you today, besides this idea of transcending the ego, is a little bit about the life of Swami Kriyananda. For those of you that may not know Swami Kriyananda, he was a great disciple of our guru, Paramahansa Yogananda. And Swamiji is, as he's often called, Ananda, founded Ananda in 1969 in California, in 68, 69, and helped to start communities and meditation groups and this great spiritual work all over the world. And Swami Kriyananda was a saint, someone with very little ego, someone with tremendous willpower and energy and creativity. But I believe all he would define himself, We think of ego and of self-definition as a disciple, as a humble disciple of Yogananda, and made it clear that he was never to be worshipped as a guru, as a master in his own right. But it was clear to see, for those that had eyes to see, that he was and is a great saint in that spirit of divine consciousness. And there's an element of the ego, again, expressed through Swami Kriyananda's life beautifully, that we never lose our sense of self. That I'll come to this point shortly in more depth, but that there's a unique soul, spark of divinity within each one of us, and that even as we transcend the ego and our little self and express the divine self, that each one of us has something beautiful and extraordinary to share in our lives, in whatever way that is manifested for each of us. And as I said, in the life of Swami Kriyananda, he was a prolific writer. Thousands of lectures, hundreds of books, hundreds of beautiful songs, pieces of music, choral and instrumental, on and on his list of so-called accomplishments. And he would say, I don't feel that I've done anything because I've always tuned into spirit and tried to let that flow through me. And again, among all of these many divine qualities, one thing that Swami Kriyananda also stressed and expressed was having spiritually a sense of humor. And he said that it can be helpful to us spiritually if we maintain a sense of humor in order to have perspective in life, that we don't take ourselves, that we don't take life too seriously, and that we maintain a sense of lightness and divine joy. And I experienced this when I met Swami Kriyananda on a few different occasions. Once in Los Angeles, if you can believe, Ananda had an ashram at the time near Hollywood in a nice neighborhood called Highland Park. And there was a big marble living room about this size. And Swamiji was giving a lecture or a satsang there. And being new to Ananda and kind of in awe of Swami Kriyananda, I sat in the back, as I had heard you could do with saints, and tried to close my eyes and tune in inwardly and just sit up straight and soak in the divine wisdom that was going to flow through Swamiji. And Swami, instead of starting with the divine wisdom, started with a joke. And he said there were 4 Italian mothers. First one, they were all bragging about their son. First one said, my son's a priest in the Catholic Church, and people see him and say, oh, Holy Father, and wow, good for you. And the second mother said, well, my son, he's risen up to the rank of a bishop in the church, and he's also considered very holy, and people see him and just bow before him and say, oh, your holiness, your reverence. And again, not to be outdone, the third mother says, my son's a bishop. You know, he could be in line, or excuse me, a cardinal. He could be in line to be the Pope himself, you know, and they all say, oh, your eminence, your greatness. And of course, the fourth mother, Swami said, she said, well, my son's none of those things. He's big and huge and tall, and people see him coming and say, oh my God. And Swami would tell jokes sometimes, even a little bit irreverent ones. And for a couple reasons, I think. One, it loosened me up and snapped me out of a stiff sense of, you know, what was spiritual and what was wisdom. And that was one thing, is that it was disarming, you know, is that it was a way for us to relax and laugh and get in our hearts. And then the divine wisdom would come, you know, in words and in vibration. But also that there was joy and laughter and a sense of happiness that didn't have to come from some lofty, you know, far off divine source. And that's a hallmark of the saints. As Yogananda said, a sad saint is a sad saint indeed. Excuse me. Another time, you know, Swami Kriyananda was, as I said, a man of tremendous willpower who also faced a number of just really awful challenges in his life, personally and through the work of Ananda. One of the hardest things he faced and Ananda faced was a terrible lawsuit in the 1990s that almost destroyed this work of Ananda. And you can read about it in a wonderful book called A Fight for Religious Freedom, and you can read various levels of things online that may be true or not. But at any rate, Swami kept his head held high and instructed people at Ananda to face this as a spiritual opportunity, and again, to maintain a sense of humor and always to stick to principles and to what is right, and not to cling to our ego or a sense of, defensiveness or judgment of others. And after a particularly grueling day in a legal trial where Swami himself was on the witness stand and he was being grilled by a litigator who was very unfriendly, who was cruel, really, and trying to harass Swamiji and really at him for a long time. Everyone was feeling just downtrodden and discouraged by this experience, understandably. And afterwards, some people after the trial came to Swamiji and asked him, "How are you doing, sir?" And that was just brutal. And are you okay? And Swami, with a little smile, just took on an affectation of James Bond, and he said, "Shaken but not stirred." And he modeled for us, the ability to stay poised and to stay centered amongst terrible circumstances, if necessary. As Yogananda said, the yogi stands unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds. And our lives may not often be that experience of breaking worlds, but we will have to face our challenges and our tests personally and collectively on some level. And those are spiritual opportunities for us to stand unshaken, to be shaken perhaps, but not stirred. And again, Swami emphasized this again and again in his life. Just one more fun anecdote with Swamiji. Gita and I had a great blessing of being with him in Europe on one of his lecture trips there in a little beautiful town in Switzerland called Lugano. And we were visiting at a hotel there where he gave a lecture and we sang some songs. And afterwards, we were in the lobby of the hotel with Swamiji, just us having coffee together and just sharing a blessing, darshan. And as we were sitting in the corner of the lobby there, we noticed that Swami looked up across the room, and with a big beaming smile, he waggled one of his ears at somebody, at something. And we looked over, and some other man was smiling and waggling his ears back at Swami. And we said, "Swami, who is that man? And, what is the ear thing?" And Swami said, who was a man with very large ears, he said, "That man is the only person I've ever met with larger ears than mine." He said, "Last night we met at dinner at the restaurant, and we became friends." And so he gave him a waggle. And again, Swami had a way of making friends everywhere he went. He did it with a natural sense of humor, of joy, of kindness, of friendship. And it just came naturally to him. And that's what I would say again about spiritual humor and joy, is that it's always taking us toward God. Yogananda himself was a great example of this too. He liked to play jokes and pranks and had a wonderful, delightful sense of humor, but it was always directed towards God and towards divine joy. It was never at the expense of others. It was never harmful in the slightest possible way, but always came back to that center of divine joy. And I want to share with you a few things that Swami Kriyananda shares in a book of his called Sadhu Beware. And this is a book about renunciation and non-attachment and what it means to really be a yogi. And Swami Kriyananda gives some good tips in here about working with ego. He says to be an ego detective. And for one thing, he says to pay attention to when we're holding tension in the body, just on a practical level, and especially at the point of the medulla, at the base of the brain, this anatomical point in the body where Yogananda said ego actually resides in the body, just as our spiritual center is here at the point between the eyebrows. He said at this chakra, this center of energy at the base of the brain, that this is the seat of ego, and that this is also a divine seat of energy, of prana entering the body, and therefore gives us this opportunity, he said, when we feel tension here, to relax it, to offer it forward, and to release that sense of myself, that I need to defend myself or define myself or have any sense of, building walls around myself. And so I just want to share with you, out of, I think, 33 different tips he gives, just about 10 or so different examples I'll paraphrase with just a little bit of commentary. And these are very practical things to work with ego, again, that help us to transcend our little sense of self. So Swamiji says that if you like something, perhaps if you have the opportunity to go shopping, he said, buy it and then give it away for someone else to enjoy. And in this way, you can enjoy it twice. He says, if you go unacknowledged for something good you've done, if you're guilty and found guilty for something perhaps bad you've done, whether it's due or undue, he says, give all credit, praise, scold, and blame to God in your heart. He says to let others express their eager views, but to reserve your own views for receptive interest. This next one's a good one for husbands. He says, go along with bossiness if you're bossed around. Other husbands, not necessarily me. Workers, anyone. Swamiji says, do not justify who or what you are. In other words, your ego, to defend and justify yourself. He says to never mentally compete with or belittle others. Swamiji says, always be guided by principles and not desires. And he says to laugh with, but never at others. Give God your talents, your skills, and your mistakes. Enjoy being unimportant. And finally, give respect and even reverence equally to those who praise or insult you. And again, these are just examples of how we can work with our sense of self practically in the world in order to grow spiritually, to use our egos in a beneficial way. And ultimately, it comes not through our own self-effort alone, but through the grace of Spirit, of God and Guru, as Swami himself exemplified as a great disciple. He made great spiritual progress at Mount Washington in his time personally with Yogananda in his first couple of years there. But it wasn't through his own effort. He was reminded of that one day when he heard through some of his fellow disciples that Yogananda had said, just look how I've changed him. Swami Kriyananda, he called him Walter. Look how I've changed Walter. And Swami realized through this that it wasn't only through his effort, but it was especially through his attunement to Yogananda, his receptivity to the Guru, to God, that he could be changed. We often refer to this formula, which bears repeating, which Yogananda says all of the spiritual path of self-realization comes 50% of it through the grace of God. 25%, he says, comes through the Guru, effort, grace on our behalf. And only 25% is our effort, which takes 100%, of course, of what we have to offer. But it's only to align ourselves with that 3/4 of the work that God and Guru will carry the load for us. And so whether you're a disciple of Yogananda or just a devotee, a soul-seeking spirit, to recognize that there is this higher power that we have to align ourselves with, and that it's through divine grace, ultimately, that we rise. Swami Kriyananda, as I said, was a great example of this and exemplified the divine self. There's a character in the Mahabharata which Yogananda gives spiritual significance to or many of the key characters, one of them being Bhishma, who represents ego. But there's a lesser known character who's actually a half-brother of Bhishma, called Vichitrabirya, and he represents the divine ego, that divine self, which Swami said is never lost. When we become self-realized, that our sense of self is firmly established forever in the divine. And again, there is that beautiful and special song that God has to sing through each one of us. I just want to close. Oh, and it reminded me of a quote that I've often repeated and loved that Swami Kriyananda shared, which is, he said, "The more I think of God and the less I think of me, the more I find everything in life works out as it's supposed to, and that life becomes a song of joy when you live in this way." And so, again, all of our lives can be a song of joy if we transcend the little self to live more and more in God. I'll just close with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. Just give me a moment to find it here. This is most beautiful reading, a poem of Yogananda's called "I Was Made for Thee Alone." So if you'd like, you can close your eyes and just tune in to the soul whispers of Yogananda, of the soul and its oneness with spirit. I was made for thee alone. I was made for dropping flowers of devotion gently at thy feet on the altar of the morning. My hands were made to serve thee willingly, to remain folded in adoration, waiting for thy coming. And when thou comest, to bathe thy feet with my tears. My voice was made to sing thy glory. My feet were made to seek thy temples everywhere. My eyes were made a chalice to hold thy burning love and the wisdom falling from thy nature's hands. My ears were made to catch the music of thy footsteps echoing through the halls of space, and to hear thy divine melodies flowing through all heart tracks of devotion. My lips were made to breathe forth thy praises and thine intoxicating inspirations. My love was made to throw incandescent searchlight flames to find thee hidden in the forest of my desires. My heart was made to respond to thy call alone. My soul was made to be the channel through which thy love might flow uninterruptedly into all thirsty souls. Om. Peace.